In November of 2002, at Cook County Circuit Court in Chicago, young college freshman filed a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit against her own father. She was Liesel Pritzker. On the other side of the case sat her father, Robert Pritzker, and 11 of her older cousins. The family controlled Hyatt Hotels, the Marmon Industrial Group, a large stake in Royal Caribbean Cruises, and roughly 200 other companies, held inside more than 950 interlocking trusts. She wore fleece to class and watched what she spent on Broadway tickets. What the complaint did not say, and what almost nobody understood at the time, is that her father had already set aside $200 million for this exact lawsuit. He did it years before she filed. He did it before she knew there was anything to ask about. Think about what that means. He had run the numbers on his own daughter suing him, and he had decided the number was affordable. That is the story. Not a father who lost his temper. A father who did arithmetic, and he did it because the family he came from had done nothing else for 100 years. Nicholas Pritzker arrived in Chicago in 1881, a 10-year-old fleeing a village near Kiev with no English and no money. He slept his first night in the train station. He learned to read by sounding out headlines on the corners where he sold newspapers, worked his way through DePaul Law School and opened Pritzker and Pritzker. He carried one thing out of Ukraine, and it was his name. Everything the family built later sat on top of it. His son, A.N. Pritzker, spent his life making sure nobody could see what that name owned. Starting in the late 1960s, he moved large parts of the fortune into trusts in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. When he died in 1986 with a fortune Forbes put at $2.3 billion, the Internal Revenue Service found almost no estate tax had been paid, called the whole arrangement a sham, and alleged that more than $94 million in property had been shifted offshore to escape American taxation. 13 cases followed. More than $150 million was at stake. The family largely won. Understand what those 950 trusts actually did. They were not a vault. A vault has one door, and everybody knows where it is. This was hundreds of small containers, each holding a slice of something, each one able to be moved, sold, or handed to somebody else without a single person being told. The structure did not protect wealth, it removed witnesses. J. Pritzker built the visible half of the empire on the same principle. He bought a 149-room motel across from the Los Angeles airport in 1957 and wrote the check on a napkin. He financed the Atlanta hotel with the open atrium that Conrad Hilton called a concrete monster, and every other chain refused. His brother Robert turned a $3 million Castor company into the Marmon Group, more than 125 manufacturers doing $6 to $7 billion a year. TransUnion in 1980, Ticketmaster in 1982. Almost no interviews, almost no photographs, billions of dollars and no face. Then in June of 1995, in an apartment on Chicago's North Shore, Jay put a price on it out loud. He was 72 and dying of heart disease. He named Tom, Nick, and Penny to run everything, and the cousins who did not want to run anything were offered up to $25 million each in cash to accept it and stay quiet. That is the most important sentence in the whole story. The family had just proved that silence had a number. 6 years later, the 11 adult cousins signed a secret agreement to break up $15 billion and pay themselves about $1.3 billion each. The number had simply gone up. Robert Pritzker was watching all of this from inside a divorce. He had married an Australian woman named Irene Dryberg, whom he met at a Pritzker-owned Hyatt in Australia. They married in 1980 and divorced in 1989 when Liesel was 5. They fought over custody, over schooling, over the maid, over the pets. The pattern starts smaller and uglier than any trust document. It starts with her name. When Alfonso Cuarón cast her in A Little Princess at 11, her father refused to let her be credited under anything that could be read as a win for her mother. So she built one herself. She took her younger brother's first name and went to work as Liesel Matthews. She was good. Harrison Ford, after Air Force One, compared her to a young Jodie Foster. She was 13, critically praised and completely unknown to the public as a billionaire's child. That distinction matters more than it looks. For those few years, the only money in her life arrived under a name her father had no authority over. Everything else she owned sat in trusts he had been handed sole control of in October of 1994, when Tom Pritzker and the family attorney Marshall Eisenberg stepped back as trustees. And by then, according to her later complaint, assets had already been moving out of those trusts for a year. What happened next was quiet by design. Her 5% stake in the parent company of Hyatt, one of the most valuable positions in the entire empire, was donated to the family foundation. Other assets were sold to relatives with 5% paid in cash and the remaining 95% due over 25 years at almost no interest. Which is not a sale. It is a gift wearing a suit. Beneficial interests were simply redirected to other Pritzkers with nothing paid at all. Every one of those moves had the same property. None of them required telling a 9-year-old girl anything. And when the case finally came, Tom Pritzker's lawyers did not deny the transfers had happened. They argued the transfers were permitted because A.N. Pritzker had written the trusts to give trustees exactly that much discretion. That defense is an admission. It says the silence was legal. It says the document had been built so that the person losing the money would never have standing to ask a question about it. So Robert set aside $200 million and waited. He was following the family method precisely. Identify the person who might make noise. Estimate what quiet costs. Fund it in advance. It had worked on the IRS. It had worked on the cousins in 1995. It had worked on the American public for 3 generations. It failed on one person, and it failed at a dinner table. In the fall of 2002, during her freshman year at Columbia, Liesel had dinner in Chicago with her cousin Tom, chairman of Hyatt, head of the governing 3, and the man most answerable for what had happened to her while she was a child. Nobody has ever said what he told her. She has described it in 6 words. He said some things. She filed in November, $6 billion. Her brother Matthew filed his own suit in April of 2003. Her lawyer Liesel Pritzker said plainly that the point of the filing was to find out what had happened to those trusts when she was a young girl, and that the financial questions could be settled afterward. She said it more bluntly. This is not about cash, she told Forbes. It is not like she thought winning meant a Bentley. She filed because she wanted to know what happened. That is the moment the transaction broke. Every previous Pritzker who was owed something had accepted money instead of an answer. She asked for the answer first and let the money follow. Her father's public response performed the wound. It is sad, he said, when a daughter who is a beneficiary of great family wealth sues her own family. The family called the suit an absolute shock. Then their lawyers went to the judge and had the entire file sealed, arguing that opening it would damage the businesses and put the youngest heirs at risk. Inside the family, that worked. It had always worked. Everyone with a claim on the Pritzkers had been someone the Pritzkers could pay. A newspaper is not a beneficiary. The Chicago Tribune sued to break the seal, and there was no distribution that could be offered to make it stop. In late 2004, the Illinois Appellate Court ruled that proceedings held in publicly funded courtrooms belonged to the public. That is how the 950 trusts stopped being a rumor, cataloged in a 400-page exhibit that arrived almost entirely blacked out. In January of 2005, the case settled. Liesel and Matthew each received between $280 and $300 million in cash, plus roughly $170 million still held in trust. That was about a third of what each older cousin stood to collect. Part of it came from the $200 million Robert had set aside years earlier. He had guessed low, but he had guessed. His statement was carefully built. He loved them dearly, he said, and he had not personally gained from the transfers he managed as trustee. He did not say the transfers had not happened. He did not say they had been good for his children. He was 78 and had Parkinson's disease. He died in October of 2011. Their statement said they were pleased to end the litigation and wished their cousins well. It said nothing about their father. There was no reconciliation, then or later. And here is what the settlement actually unlocked, which the family understood immediately, and almost nobody outside it did. You cannot sell a $7 billion industrial group while an unresolved fiduciary claim sits on the assets. 3 years later, Warren Buffett bought 60% of Marmon for $4.5 billion, and Berkshire completed the purchase by 2013. Hyatt listed on the New York Stock Exchange in November of 2009. TransUnion was sold in 2010 and went public in 2015. The empire did not fall, it cashed out. Then the family did the strangest thing in its history. Having lost its privacy, it started selling visibility instead. Penny Pritzker became Secretary of Commerce in 2013, and at her confirmation disclosed $54 million in fees for overseeing the family's offshore trusts. AN's quiet machine, finally read aloud in a Senate hearing room. J.B. Pritzker became governor of Illinois in 2019, won again in 2022, and announced a third-term run in 2025. In 2023, Penny was appointed the United States Special Representative for Ukraine's economic recovery, serving until January of 2025, sent back to the country her great-great-grandfather fled, this time carrying American capital. Liesel took her share and built something else. In 2012, she and her husband Ian Simmons founded the Blue Haven Initiative, one of the first family offices designed entirely around impact investing. In 2020, she signed a public letter from wealthy Americans asking to be taxed more. She is the only person to come out of that fortune arguing that the machine which produced it should not be legal. She never got the full accounting. The complete trust list is still redacted, but look at the name on that letter: Liesel Pritzker Simmons. At 11, she took a name to survive her father. As an adult, she signed one she chose herself, on a document arguing that families like hers should not be allowed to disappear. She never took her father down. She just stopped being something he could move.